Pia Thompson and IT costs. Why are we having a conversation? I think we all have the experience that for many of our organizations that we've worked with, IT costs is one of the biggest areas of expense that the organizations face. There's a lot of different aspects to it, and it's changing all the time, particularly with developments that are going on in the IT field. And as the CFO, one thing that we all love to do is find a way to save costs. So I am really happy to have Pia here to give us some insight into the topic and share learnings that she's had from quite a long and illustrious career in IT, cost and selling it and managing it. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Pia to introduce herself, please.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everybody. Pia Thompson, I am a cost management and containment consultant, executive advisor. I've been in the IT industry for more years than I care to actually enunciate in public, but it's been a while. I started my career very early. I was a teenage programmer, just so you know, as a developer on the IT build back in the days when most everything had to be built. Very little off-the-shelf software was available. I then, after 10 years of doing that, I moved into sales and sales management and business ownership. Most recently, I worked for IBM for 7 years in some pretty key roles in the media and entertainment space. And then most recently, my most recent position is to do this executive leadership, semi-retired, doing it both out of enjoyment in giving to salespeople what I received from customers for years and years, as well as, I do have a lot of experience that I'm hopeful my customers experience the benefit of.
Thanks for that, Pia. So before we get into the specifics of your presentation, maybe a couple of icebreaker questions. So can you share what your favorite podcast or streaming show or movie is for you at the moment?
Yeah, so I am addicted to the streaming world. It's part of what I did for 7 years at IBM was covering media and entertainment companies like Time Warner and Time Inc. I binge a lot and I re-binge. I don't, at the moment we started watching the Ozark, the first half of the final season. And so that's been pretty awesome. But I've been known to sit and binge, shows. My husband calls to see if I'm going to come up for air, but I've been known to sit in front of the TV for hours watching.
So you'll have to help me because I only joined the streaming world about a month ago.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Oh.
And I only have basic cable. I don't even have any of the advanced stuff.
You don't need anything more than basic cable.
Yeah, we have very little here. So it's not my obsession yet, but what I am looking forward to are the Olympics. So I am looking forward to the Olympics starting. I think they start within a week or so. I am looking forward to that and watching all those athletes and those terrific events. Yeah. So that's what I'm looking forward to in the next week. And Pia, if you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be and why?
That's an interesting question. So I think it would be my maternal grandmother. I mean, for sure, any of my grandparents, but specifically my maternal grandmother. She was born in 1899. And wow. So, I mean, obviously she's been passed a long time, but the things that have changed in the world since 1899. She died when I was in my early 20s. So I did have an opportunity to have a long time with her, but I don't know that I appreciated learning about what her life was like before I knew her. And I think what would be interesting would be to sit down with her and hear what it was like in their pandemic, to hear what it was like to live in a 2-room house, not even a house, in a 2 rooms with, there were 8 kids,
Wow.
no electricity, coal for heat. She didn't have electricity growing up. She didn't have a phone until she actually moved to the United States in the late 60s. So just so many things I think would be really interesting. And I think I only appreciate the need for having done that now that I'm a little bit older. And I think with these technologies that we have now, we have the ability to record those things for our family and friends and share them, not just in a professional setting, but also in a personal setting. And I think more importantly, in a personal setting.
Yeah, I was reading very recently, or seeing something on TV about recommendations to almost write a book, if you will, from different members of the generation to be able to share the family history and keep that alive, because as generations passed, so much of their learning or their experiences can be lost. And it's, as we get older, we appreciate how much we don't want that to happen.
Right, exactly.
So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to you, Pia, and take us through the presentation you have here. What I will share with everybody is if you do have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly. Or if you're more comfortable, feel free to send it through chat. I'll monitor chat and I'm happy to ask on your behalf. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but we don't need to wait for that. And with that, Pia, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, just to let you guys know, I'm not going to have the chat open, so I'm going to be depending on Erin, because I don't have a lot of real estate on my laptop for all these windows. So I'm going to depend on Erin for queuing me on questions. So I've already gone into an overview of who I am and what I've done. Let's just say that I have a fair amount of understanding of technology and the benefits it brings businesses. But I do believe that there are instances where these vendors are holding everybody hostage. And so that's why I always approach my prospective clients and my active clients with an understanding of what frustrates them about IT. And it's not always about what works and what doesn't work. I feel like we are also very frustrated, at least I have over the most recent years, become very frustrated with the escalating costs of IT. I had many conversations in my role, my many roles at IBM, with customers around how do we keep charging more and more every year, and it doesn't appear that we get the same improvements commensurate with the amount that technology cost increases year over year. And so that really is what drove me to the next chapter, the current chapter of my professional career, which is to really focus on helping companies minimize their investment expenditure, but maximize the product feature function that they can obtain with the same dollars. So just a short overview of what we're going to do in today's event. I want to go along some baseline definitions, make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the technical lingo, because it is a little bit more complicated today than ever before. We'll talk about the challenge in terms of pricing and how to figure out what the correct pricing of technology is. I'll help you understand if you got a good deal or not. We'll talk about navigating the environment with vendors, and hopefully you will walk away from today's meeting with a pile of tips and tricks that you would have learned from my experience and my expertise that'll help you in your negotiation of your IT investments. I do want this to be as interactive as possible. It's great to see people's faces on video, but I don't really love just sitting here talking. I like to hear people's interactions. Feel free to share your experiences. if you have an experience, either positive or negative, that you want to share with the group. Let's make it enjoyable for everybody and a learning experience for everybody, including myself. All right, so let's talk about some definitions just to make sure we're on the same page. Obviously, these are pretty simple: hardware, software, services, and on-prem. I think these are terms that we've been familiar with for a long time, right? And there's nothing really hard to understand about them. But I think when we start to get into some of the newer terms like managed service providers, what's in the cloud, what's as a service, what's hybrid, and then all of these acronyms, and I'm happy to go through those acronyms with you, but it becomes a little bit more complicated. So if you think about a company like AWS or Microsoft Azure, they can be considered cloud, they can be considered as a service, they can be considered hybrid, and they can also be considered managed service. They would typically be more in the hardware, software, services side. They typically wouldn't be engaged, although their technology would be on-prem. But managed service providers are typically vendors who all they do is provide you information technology as a service. They manage all the infrastructure. They deal with all the hardware and software. Some of those solutions can be billed on a monthly subscription basis. Some of those can be billed on an annual subscription basis. You might own the license for the software, or they may own the license for the software, but at the end of the day, it's a data center that would host your solutions.
Yeah, maybe a question from me, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Looking at this page and all these components, is there a typical breakdown between how much of a total cost an organization has that you would expect to have in hardware versus software versus services? And is it changing? Would we expect that percentage shift between these components? What is it moving to in your perspective?
So every company is different, right? As much as everybody says, you know, my business is different, my business is unique. That is true when it comes to technology. There are some companies that are technology forward, meaning they invest a lot of money in technology to drive their businesses. And there are other companies that don't invest a lot of money. I'm hoping that I can't give you a definitive answer on a percentage of perhaps things like gross revenue, right? Like you might think of other assets that you acquire. It just really depends on the way the company approaches technology.
Okay.
And if that question comes up again later on, maybe we can touch on it in some of the other slides.
Okay.
So think about, let's talk about some of these other terms as well. If you think about in the cloud, it sounds like a scary thing, but it really means when it's not in your premises, when it's anywhere else. It can be if you use LinkedIn, that's a cloud offering. If you use salesforce.com, that's a cloud offering, right? You use Facebook. These are all
Instagram.
things. Instagram is a cloud
TikTok.
offering. I would say most of the technologies everybody uses on their phone, right? Those are all cloud-based technologies, unless you actually open a Word document and use Word on your phone. But I don't know if we have licensing for that. We'll have to look into that. Anyway, so when we talk about hybrid means you have your technology in more than one place. It can be in multiple clouds. And in fact, I would venture to say that every organization, whether they claim it or not, actually has a hybrid footprint.
So did they do that for purposes of disaster recovery or to reduce dependency or concern around if this cloud goes down, this cloud should still be up, or for cost, for all of it?
So I don't think people realize that because they use multiple tools and some of them are in their data centers and some of the tools are outside of their data center by nature, that's a hybrid solution.
Okay.
A specific deployment can be also implemented in a hybrid solution, right? So I'm trying to think of, so for example, if you use outlook.com, right? That's in the cloud, obviously, because you see the .com, but you can also have the Office products installed on your laptop. That would be considered a hybrid solution. So that's where one technology is installed both on your technology, your platform, your computer, your physical computer, as well as there's a component in the cloud. But typical companies today are all hybrid because they have some technology installed in their data centers and some technologies outside of their data centers. And as a service, actually, most people think of it as cloud, but as a service is not cloud. As a service is more of a licensing model where you're paying a subscription fee. In my last few years at IBM, we actually had technologies that were running in the cloud, but in the first few years that I was working at IBM, we only had as a service, which basically meant instead of purchasing a license upfront and then paying the annual maintenance, you paid a subscription fee every month for the license that you were using, and it could have been installed in your data center, right? That really just is a licensing model. And so that if we go back to the list of acronyms that I have here, infrastructure as a service refers to if you have hardware that you don't physically own the hardware, you're just, it's kind of like your Con
Renting
Edison
it?
bill. Sorry, Erin?
Kind of like you're renting it.
Yes, yes. And typically speaking, yes. And all of these models, when they talk about as a service, it's all that rental model, right? Similar to a car where you lease the car versus owning the car.
Mhm.
So we have, who's not heard, maybe BCP, business continuity processing is as a service where you don't actually fully implement a, back in, I'm going to show my age now, where we used to go to off-site to have our disaster recovery tests.
Yep.
These days, you can set up your business continuity process to be the flip of a button just sitting at your desk, and you physically don't have to go to another facility to test that. I think the other one that's not a common term for people is the UCaaS. That's Unified Communications as a Service. So if you have a telephone system in your company where you can have it forward to your cell phone or have it simultaneously ring on your cell phone and your desk telephone, those are typically as a service technologies. Okay, so let's try to get into the meat of this if we can. So let's talk about what I think is the big challenge. I think it's really hard for people to understand what is the real price of technology. It's not like, let me rephrase myself. There are some vendors who post pricing on their website. So you can go, I'll give you HubSpot as an example. It's a CRM tool that I use. You can go to their website. They have a public page that talks about what the price per user is for all of their technologies, except when you get into the enterprise space. It's fairly common practice across multiple vendors who do publish their pricing, that when you're looking at enterprise-wide licensing, meaning more than probably 50 to 100 users, that you start to lose the ability to get clarity on what the real price of technology. And we'll talk about ways of getting around that in a later slide. I think the other one that's really difficult to understand is, did you really get a good deal? I'm not sure if you've moved from company to company and perhaps been involved in negotiations of similar products and found that perhaps you didn't actually get a great deal, because when you move to a new company, you see that the price per license is way different than what you were paying for. And that is part of the issue, I think, with technology, is there is not really a standard price. And then the question becomes, if I did overpay, can I actually recover those overpayments? And we'll talk about that again later on.
And Pia, maybe just, I'm sorry, going back to the last page for a quick
Sure.
second. When you talk about the real price of technology, are there technology costs that show up in an organization differently that make it difficult to get the whole picture together? And, where do we need to think about looking at cost to make sure we're thinking of the whole cost of technology?
So when I talk about the real price of technology, I'm talking about a specific widget. And how do I know what the price of that widget really is? Except for those vendors that publish pricing on their website, it's not like you can. I think back to years ago with the car industry, where they used to say, "Oh, how far off tissue price is that?" Right? You don't have that, because it's like a. And we're going to get into this in way big detail in the next slide, but
Okay.
It's like all smoke and mirrors almost.
Okay.
And I can say that because I sold technology for 25 years.
There you go.
So let's talk about the way we were. Let me paint a scenario for you. How many of you have been engaged in a situation like this with a software vendor that they do presentations, they do demos, perhaps they even allow you the opportunity to do a proof of concept based on some either RFI or RFP, where you talk about the features and functions of a product that you're looking for, right? It always seems like it works so beautifully when they do the demonstrations, right? It's like this perfectly beautiful space. And yet when it comes to the implementation in your organization, there's this massive black hole, and you don't understand how you're in the middle of the black hole and you don't know where it ends, right? And during your negotiation process, perhaps you may have had some of your team, you might not have been in the direct conversations, but have your team do the evaluations of features and functions. And then it comes down to the time to ask for the proposal and the pricing. And you get the pricing and you're sticker shocked because you don't understand how it went from $50,000 to $100,000, and you didn't really change the requirements. And the salesperson might say to you, "You know what? You're a special customer. I really think I can get something done for you here. Let me go run this thing up the flagpole and see what I can do for you." And there's some back and forth that happens where you have phone calls and emails, and they ask to speak to your manager and they want to know what the budget is, and you go back and forth, and then lo and behold, they come back to you with this, "Oh, I got it for you. It's $55,000. And I got the best deal. If you sign by the end of this quarter, we'll be able to honor that deal." How many of you have actually had that experience? Because I can tell you, honestly, I did it all the time.
So was that done with the way of, you had a client that was sort of hooked, then you give them a bigger number, and then you bring it down to show them that you're on their side and get them all excited to sign, and forget that the original price was below where they ended up anyway?
Their original, like they told you the original price was
Right.
50, but they ended up at 55. And you're like, how did it get to be this level, right? So that is, to me, the way we were. Now, again, we don't have a lot of this smoke and mirrors anymore, because there's so many products that are in the cloud that you can sign up for free versions and play with it before you even get engaged with a salesperson. But you still don't really know what the real price of that technology is, because if you're buying for more than a small group, you're going to go to that enterprise level pricing, which is in that smoke and mirror section. So let's talk about what the real price of technology is. And because there's really no published pricing available, I wanted to show you that there are some resources that you can use that are publicly available for you to do some hunting of pricing. Not every vendor is going to be available in any of these platforms, but they're good tools to use to understand what is the price. And just so you know, there isn't really one firm price. vendors usually have different pricing based on industry. Typically speaking, in financial services, they typically pay the most.
Because they
Government,
can pay the most, or they think they're the richest, or why is that?
because they usually have the deepest pockets.
Yeah.
Government usually gets a great price. And remember, a vendor does never ever sells anything for a loss. They never do. Even if your salesperson says, oh, I'm selling this to you at a loss, no way, no how. Because internal systems, when salespeople are being evaluated, typically they're being evaluated based on the total transaction size and the profitability of that deal. There's more than one measurement that they go into when they look at the discounting pricing. So let me get back. Government has usually a separate price. Not-for-profits usually have a separate price list. Educational institutions have a separate price list. Typically, the other industries that are for-profit typically fall in the same bucket in terms of price lists. But knowing there are certain industries that have varying prices. But you can use these publicly available websites, SHI and connection.com. They're both wholesalers as well as distributors of product, but they do sell direct to the they do B2B. And you can search their sites and put in either a SKU or a product name. And you would be surprised, they actually show this is the price for government, this is the price for
Wow.
education.
So are you ever able to, understanding that now, Pia, and I certainly it makes sense, but I never thought of it. If you are, say, a financial services company and you can gain this insight, are you ever able to use that to negotiate a better price with the vendor then?
Yes, and we'll talk about it.
Okay, sorry, I
at
didn't
the
mean to
very
jump
end.
ahead.
No,
Got it.
no, that's definitely what we'll be talking about.
Okay.
So
So,
hopefully
and just for the benefit of everyone, we will send this presentation out after today's meeting. So you will have the links. Don't worry about copying them down. You will get the presentation.
right, and just so you know, the GSA.gov, that is the what the government negotiates with all their IT, well, all their vendors, but there is a subsection of the GSA where you can actually look at line item pricing for SKUs.
Great.
Okay, so let's talk about the ways in which companies determine if they got a good deal. And typically, there's 4 ways. You look at the budget, you look at the ROI, you go to research companies like Gartner and Forrester, and then you evaluate what the discount is, right? And so those are all not great methods to determine if you've got a good deal. And I'll tell you why. Because budget, when you're buying something for the first time, you don't really know what the cost is until you've actually purchased, right? But then once you purchase the product, you look at what you paid for something last year and you budget a similar dollar amount for this year. It's very rare that people, and I'm going to tread lightly here because you guys are all in the finance. You're all looking at the numbers and you're trying to forecast as best as possible. But that is not a good way to determine whether or not you got a good deal.
Yeah.
The ROI is also not a great way because typically when you start building ROIs, your salespeople would always offer you an ROA calculation that they can give you. Now, you may not incorporate what they give you into your calculations, but they will always give you an ROI where it looks like this was the best thing since sliced bread, that your business cannot live without this technology. So beware of salespeople who give you ROI calculation sheets.
And what did they forget to include? Overpromise, underdeliver.
Correct. There's no column that you can calculate that on an Excel spreadsheet.
No.
And the research organizations, they're great actually at a macro level to understand vendor capabilities, ability to execute, ability to sustain their product evolution over the long haul. They're not great when it comes to pricing, because typically their research results on pricing is 2 to 3 quarters old. It's really difficult to evaluate your purchasing today if the numbers you've been given are actually 2 or 3 months old, 2 or 3 quarters old, because guess what? Technology costs less every day. And think about it. How much did you pay for the first phone you ever had and the functionality you had on that phone? And how much are you paying for the phone today with the functionality you're getting?
I don't know. I have a tendency to be paying more because I'm buying the Apple product and I'm getting the newest and the greatest, and I want the most storage and I want everything. I want all the bells and whistles. So I may not be a good example of that, Pia.
But when you look at features and functionality of the phone and what it did yesterday versus what it does today, the phone is actually cheaper.
From that perspective, yes. Just more
Okay.
more hard dollars out of my pocket.
Correct. Definitely more hard dollars.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with companies like Forrester, like Gartner, you want to take their advice on pricing with a grain of salt, because they will always tell you got a great deal. And they will always give you, I've never seen anybody get that pricing, but that's not true. And when you look at pricing from a discount perspective and you're thinking about a great deal, you can't use that either, because if you remember in the previous slide, I talked about how many different price lists there were. So depending upon which price list they're starting you at,
Right.
if there's no
We're
standard
finance
price
people.
list-
We know that you can make anything look good or bad depending on what you pick up and what you don't pick up.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So that's why I say, don't use these when you determine what a good deal is. And so can you uncover past overpayments? 100%, you absolutely can. It is more difficult.
And when you say an overpayment, Pia, can you talk a little bit about what's an overpayment, meaning the invoice came through and it was charging more than the invoice?
No,
Or
what
do you
I'm
mean something
saying
else?
is, so you've negotiated with, let's take hardware, because this is very typical on hardware, especially in this climate of things moving to the cloud. You've negotiated a price. Let's just say it's $10, right?
Yep.
And you've had it for 3 years, so you've paid, and I'm going to make it very simple, $10 for 3 years. But in the middle of the 3rd year, you realize that, based on some research that has come out, that you actually should have paid $8.50. Well, there is a way to recover that $1.50 for the past 2.5 years in the next round of negotiations with the vendor.
But if you've already agreed to $10, why would it be that maybe you should have only paid 8.5? Like, what are some real examples that people could look for?
So it's again going back to the technology costs less year over year.
Okay.
Right. And so something that was, I think the first phone I had, I think I paid $1,500 for it. And all it did was hello. It didn't do anything else. Right. And every phone that I subsequently got had more and more features and functions. And I still pay the same $1,000 to $1,500 for a phone, but I have way more features. And so we can calculate what we should have gotten had we gotten the latest release, and we use that against the vendors.
Okay, so it's more about looking at what you're using now, what it would cost now, and saying that's what I should have paid for the whole time.
Correct.
Is that okay?
Correct.
Does that make sense to everybody? Because that's, when, we're used to paying, we got the invoice, we got the contract, that's what we pay. But what I'm hearing, Peter, you say is we should also be continually looking at what we're paying for, and if it's out there cheaper now, and how do we apply that to retroactive time period of the contracts?
Right. And this is most effective when buying hardware.
Okay. So not as effective for software or a cloud or a service.
It's a little bit more difficult to do in cloud. It's probably a little bit easier to do in the one-time license charged software.
Got it.
Okay. So navigating the environment. So I always urge my customers to tightly integrate their process, their procedures with their people. Something that salespeople love to do, guilty as charged, is triangulate across the number of people who are participating in the evaluation of the purchase of the product. And so they might call me, one person might call me and ask me questions. Another person might call Erin and ask her questions because she's in finance, right? I'm the IT manager. And there might be Joe, who is the actual person who's going hands-on with the technology. And when you get that kind of triangulation, and typically that only happens in companies where you might have larger teams, right? Where a lot of people are involved in the purchase process. Salespeople will use all of that information that they glean from all of the different people against you to keep the price high. Remember.
Can you give an example or a situation where you experienced that on one side of the table or another?
Well, I experienced it every single time I had a transaction at IBM. And in fact, every time I did a transaction over the course of the 25 years I was selling technology. On this side of the fence, what I do is when I work with people is I basically say, once we've gotten to the point where we've decided this is a technology we would like to purchase, nobody answers any more phone calls. The only person who answers the phone calls or responds to emails is the person who is working on the contract and the final negotiations. Because if you don't manage that process, your vendor's going to get way too much information about what's going on inside the organization. And I've even gone to the level of calling people out in company meetings to say, you cannot, Joe, you cannot answer that phone and you cannot respond to that email message, because and it's just human nature, right? Your vendor calls you, hey, Joe, you know, wanted to go for a cup of coffee and I wanted to talk to you about like where you guys are with this project, right? And Joe innocently, it's not even intentional, innocently will share information. And that really is going to work against you 100% in the negotiations, because as a negotiator, when I start to press them hard, and I usually press them very hard, they're going to go and look to find holes, to poke holes in the story so that they don't have to go to their management to get that discount.
And I would say, you know, the tactic that you're mentioning on this, Pia, it's actually a tactic that should be used for any negotiation.
Correct.
So I know that, you know, when I was in my last role and we were doing a global outsourcing, we actually went through negotiation training and we had a negotiation team and we had hierarchies built for who was allowed to talk to whom, and it was very tightly run. And it was done for these reasons. So I would just share with the team, that's a good tip to keep in mind whenever you're negotiating any contract, not only IT. So it's not that this is just an IT trick. It's a contract negotiation trick.
Right. And you can use those people on your team to intentionally leak information when you need to, in order to drive the levers to drive the deal.
Yeah, this project, it's, you know, looking like it's falling down on the priority list. Not sure if we're really going to move it forward. Not sure if we really need the technology, blah, 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 blah.
I worked on a contract with a very, you know, a household name brand when I worked at IBM, and it was a multi-million-dollar 5-year outsourced. It was people outsourcing, mainframe hardware outsourcing, processing outsourcing, everything. And this customer was dragging their feet about actually signing the contract. We had negotiated all the T's and C's. There was nothing outstanding on their part of any other ask that they had. And IBM ran on a 6-month cycle for salespeople. So I had one quota for the first 6 months of the year and another quota for the second 6 months of the year. And those two, every time my quota changed, my compensation would change. The meter would go back to 0. And the customer had confirmed in like March timeframe that we were going to close the transaction before the end of June. So yahoo, I was ready to cash my commission check, which was going to be huge because I had accumulated all my sales for the first part of the year, and getting this deal signed at the end of June was going to be a huge benefit for me. June 30th comes and goes, and nobody's answering any phone calls about signing that contract. And so another couple of days pass, 3 or 4 days, nobody's calling us back. And of course, now we have 4th of July in there, so that always messed things up a little bit. Yep. I recall calling the IT director on the 7th of July. And I was like, Jeff, what's up? What's going on with this contract paperwork? Why isn't it been signed yet? And he was, well, we're still working on things, and, we haven't quite gotten everybody together. And one of the technologies that was in the stack was not an IBM technology. It was a third party, and we had negotiated on their behalf to get a preferred price on that technology component. And I said to Jeff, I have a lot of control over influencing IBM's discounts based on time frame. I said, I have no control over the negotiation with third parties. I cannot guarantee that I'm going to be able to get you that widget for the same price that I got it for you. Do you know that they signed that contract that night and emailed it back to legal the next day? It was something very simple. But that's what it took.
Were you ultimately able to get the cost of that widget for the price you said you get it?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, good.
Because once a vendor puts out a price, it's nearly impossible for them to not honor that price, regardless of when the deal is done. Right.
But the client didn't know that.
No, the client doesn't know that unless they engage with me. They don't know that. So let's talk about a little bit about how I'm able to achieve savings when I work with a client. So if you take a look at my LinkedIn profile, you will see that there's nothing on there that talks about contract negotiations. Salespeople look at your LinkedIn profile to see who you are and what you do. Most of us like to use LinkedIn to say, I can do this and I can do that and I can do that and I can do that. The one thing I would never let anybody know is if I negotiate. Because then as soon as they know that you're a negotiator, they don't negotiate anything. They basically say that's the price it is. But if they don't realize that what your ultimate role is as negotiator, then they will actually work with you. So that's one thing. The other thing I do is, because I'm an independent contractor, typically I would never use my business email address in engaging with a client's vendor. I always engage under their email domains. So typically speaking, my client will create an email address for me under their domain name, so that I look like I'm just one of their contractors.
One of their bots.
Yep. I'm another one of their bots. I'm just moving paperwork around. I'm helping them get their paperwork done. And the good news about that is then the vendor, the customer, the company buying the technology has the email chain of everything that I've done and said with the vendor.
Yep.
Even when I'm no longer working for them. And my experience is you really only need my help for 2 or 3 years, because over the time that you use my services, you learn the techniques on how to negotiate better. And then there comes a point where I really can't get any better than what you've already gotten. So how does that work? Typically my clients, I encourage them strongly, you go ahead and you negotiate the best deal you possibly can. Don't wait for me to do my job to help you. You do the best you can in terms of your negotiation. When you're done and you've gotten a quote, a proposal from the vendor, we mark that as the baseline and you send it to me as your best and final. I take that, I look at it. I have a few tools that I've built over time that help me understand what the price could be or should be based on the current market trends. And then I let you know whether or not there's an opportunity to save money and how much money do I think we can save, mostly in percentages. I don't talk in hard dollars, I was talking percentages. And if the savings is meaningful and worth the energy, then you give me the go ahead. Typically, I need 30 days. Sometimes I need a little bit longer, depending upon the complexity of the contract. Salesforce.com definitely needs 90 days. IBM, some of their items need 90 days.
And is that because of the complexity of those organizations?
How you have to navigate through to
Right.
get to the right person to get what you need to get done.
Okay.
Then once I negotiate a better price, if I can, I give you back the revised proposal from the vendor, and then you go off and you execute. I don't make technology recommendations. I don't evaluate whether your business requirement is met based on the features and functions of the product. I'm looking strictly at the costs. That's all I'm looking at.
And where is it that you generally, in your experience, Pia, where is it that you generally see there's opportunity for savings on these contract negotiations, and why?
Hardware, any kind of hardware, there's an opportunity to save because companies are trying to get out of the
Hardware business.
Customers are trying to get out of the hardware business, and
Yeah.
vendors who are hardware vendors are trying to stay in that business. So there's a lot of opportunity there. It can be difficult to get savings in professional services because there is a cost of the person
Right.
involved.
The
right?
body.
Right. You can't make a body cheaper. So there's a little bit of a challenge there. On-prem software or the one-time license charge software, very easy to get discounts. Very, very easy. I have been quite successful in the as a service model as well. My average savings is about 18 to 23% per contract. I don't get savings on every single contract I work on, just so you know. But my average is about 18 to 23%, and my best is 43%.
Wow.
My career best. And when you're talking about that particular contract I'm thinking about was a 3-year contract was just over $1 million. So those are very meaningful numbers when you think about 18 to 23% savings.
And when you come in, are you able to manage this really as a solo act? Do you need a lot of internal resources to help support you on this?
We typically have 1 to 2 phone calls in the very beginning of the process of a specific transaction. I do my thing. I come back to you with the final revised quote. I might do a presentation to you of what's in the new structure of the deal, because I can restructure it so it's more favorable in the long term. We do that presentation and then we're done and we move on to the next one. And I think the real value of the services that I offer is that if I can't drive savings, I don't charge you a single penny. So
That
really,
that was about to be my next question is, I think we all have now a good sense of the various components of IT if we didn't have it before, and, understand that there are ways to save across many of the different bands, some maybe more than others. Are these skills that a finance person can pick up after they've done one, or is that not the best use of their time? Is it something that really they need to be more in-depthly knowledgeable and experienced with in order to come up with the savings?
so that I found there's like 4 questions in that question.
Yes, I'm sorry, I did a dump.
So I think a person who's negotiating doesn't have to be just finance, right? It can be anybody on the team. will learn over time the techniques you need to deploy in order to, like I said before, move the levers to get the deal priced at the point you want it to be. I think that, like I said, it's not a long run. I said a couple of years only because I've been working a lot with larger organizations. The more recent months, I've been focusing on the smaller companies where they don't have the capabilities. Their skill set is just limited because they have only a few people on staff, and perhaps their procurement team is not even procurement. It's just a buyer who calls a vendor and says, I need that for a better price. That's not how you negotiate with a software person or an IT person. And so I've been very successful in helping those smaller companies. And then I can train those people as we go so that they can improve their skills.
Got it.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Erin?
it does.
Okay. So I think I have, we're at the end of our, my content. Is there a question or a scenario or something that I haven't addressed that you'd like to, open it up to the group?
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to open it up to, or maybe I'll start with asking a question, and if anybody would like to unmute after me and ask a question or send it to me in chat, that would be great. My background, Pia, is, I've worked for big companies like an Allianz or a Deutsche Bank, so deep pockets, but big companies, and they have big procurement teams. Those scenarios, are those procurement teams well versed enough to be able to manage these negotiations in your experience? Do you work with these procurement teams to bring additional savings? What about people that are in those sorts of organizations?
So the larger companies I can absolutely bring value to, because I do have the sell side understanding, that no matter how long you've been on the procurement side of the house, unless you've been a sales side, you don't know how to drive the levers to get them to change, to get the pricing modified. I think my services are perceived a threat to those procurement teams.
Yeah.
Because everybody thinks they're the best negotiator. But if anybody's ever gone house shopping with their spouse and their spouse falls in love with a feature in the house, right? How do you negotiate the price of a house when your wife walks through the kitchen and she says, I absolutely love this kitchen?
I can't.
That price is not going anywhere. That price is not moving, right? So when your IT person says to the vendor, I love this technology, I can't live without it, that's it. There's no price negotiation possible. So I can bring those things to a larger organization, but like I said, they typically find me as competitive to them, not complementary.
Yeah, no, that's why I was asking, having worked with a few of the procurement teams and how much of a strong arm they have, even with their own fellow colleagues, it can be challenging. So I was curious what your experience was there.
Yeah, if you have no ego, you will definitely achieve savings using me.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for Pia? Any specific situations or examples that they'd like to ask her about or pick her brain on?
I have two questions. In my last role, we used a reverse auction as far as like getting servers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to be very successful as far as getting the price down, but I'm curious, what's your sort of...
So reverse auctions are interesting. And for those of you who may not know what a reverse auction is, you can use it only on widgets and gadgets where it's exactly the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
I find those to be, as a vendor, I hated those,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you basically, it's a race to the bottom. But I think on the buying side, it's actually very effective. You just lose the human interaction, which sometimes can drive the price even further.
Okay. And my other question is, when I was leaving, we were still in negotiations with Microsoft, and we had this sort of I want to say perpetual license, but now they're moving to everything where it's sort of a service, right?
Right, but it's probably an ELA.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, is that really how the sort of feeling was that the industry was moving that way? For enterprise, is that
Yes.
true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Even for licensing that traditionally was one-time charge licensing, they are
Mhm.
moving more to an as a service model, because why pay for it once when you can pay for it forever?
I know. It definitely didn't seem cost effective, just saying.
Is ELA enterprise something or other?
Enterprise
License
license agreement. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And Microsoft, I will say, is one of the more challenging vendors to negotiate against. And I don't have that. I usually partner with with another person that I have who has specific expertise just in Microsoft.
Is that because they're so big and complicated, because they have a seller's market with the products that they have, or both?
I never worked for Microsoft, so I don't understand the ins and outs, and they do have a very different operating model internally,
Got it.
and I haven't cracked that nut. So I use my buddy who did work for a Microsoft reseller for the better part of 6 or 7 years. So that inside knowledge really is very critical when you're doing that, when you're negotiating with one of those vendors.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Wendy.
Sure.